She had been awake since dawn, rushing through a busy airport and waiting in long lines. By the time she boarded the plane, her body begged for rest. She placed her small bag under the seat, leaned against the window, and closed her tired eyes. The hum of the engines became a lullaby, and row 22 turned into her small corner of peace. She didn't notice the passengers around her settling in, or the crew giving safety instructions. All she wanted was a few hours of quiet before reaching her destination. As the plane climbed higher, her light doze turned into a deeper sleep. Outside the window, clouds rolled like cotton fields, but she saw none of it. She dreamed of ordinary things, nothing unusual, nothing dramatic. It was just another flight, or at least it should have been. But far away in the cockpit, something unexpected was unfolding. The pilot, a calm and experienced man, had flown thousands of miles before, but today, his voice carried a strange weight as he reached for the cabin microphone. He didn't usually make requests beyond safety reminders or weather updates. Yet now, with passengers quietly reading, eating or sleeping, he clicked the button and spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice filled the cabin, steady but unusual. "We are asking if there is a Delta Force sniper on board." The words hung in the air like a sudden storm cloud. For a moment, no one moved, no one spoke. It sounded unreal, like a line from a movie, not a real-life announcement. In row 22, she stirred, blinking her heavy eyes, unsure if she had heard correctly. Her mind raced from sleep to confusion, trying to understand. Why would a pilot say something like that? Mid-flight, in front of everyone. The cabin buzzed with whispers, heads turned, eyes widened. A mother hugged her child closer. A businessman frowned at the ceiling. Even the flight attendants, though trained to stay calm, looked unsettled. She rubbed her eyes, sat straighter, and glanced at the aisle. No one around her moved to answer. No one stood up. Was it a joke, a mistake, or something far more serious? Her heartbeat picked up, because there was only one reason a pilot would ask such a thing. Something must be wrong. Something dangerous enough to need help from a military expert. In her half-awake state, she studied the people around her. The man across the aisle pretended to keep reading his magazine, but his hand shook. The elderly couple 2 rows ahead whispered urgently to each other. And somewhere behind her, a child asked, "What's a sniper?" "Mom." The air grew heavy, as if the whole plane held its breath. She wasn't in the military, she wasn't trained for emergencies. She was just an ordinary traveler who wanted sleep and quiet. But now she found herself in the middle of a scene that felt far from ordinary. Her eyes kept drifting to the front of the cabin where the crew moved quickly. They whispered among themselves, faces tight, no longer smiling. One attendant picked up the intercom phone, speaking in hushed tones. The woman in row 22 could almost hear her own pulse in her ears. The pilot's words replayed again and again in her mind. Is there a Delta Force sniper on board? It wasn't just unusual. It was alarming. She wondered if something was happening outside the plane, or maybe someone inside posed a danger. Either way, she knew this flight would not be like any other she had taken. Her thoughts went to the ground below, thousands of feet away. If something happened up here, what could anyone do? It wasn't like being in a bus or a train, where you could step off here in the air. Every soul depended on the crew and the machine, and now, maybe even on a stranger with very special skills. She gripped the armrest, her drowsiness gone. The quiet comfort of sleep had been replaced by alertness and unease. Around her, the cabin no longer felt like a group of strangers. They were linked now, passengers bound together by a mystery in the sky, and while some tried to act calm, others couldn't hide their nervous glances. The announcement was short, but its impact deep. It had turned a routine flight into a tense waiting game. Nobody knew what would happen next. Would someone stand up, revealing they were the person the pilot needed? Or would silence stretch longer, leaving everyone wondering why the question was asked? As she sat in row 22, still trying to shake off sleep, she realized one thing: her journey had just changed. She was no longer simply a passenger. She was now part of a story that she would never forget. And though she didn't know it yet, the answer to the pilot's request would shape the rest of this flight. The cabin was silent, but not the kind of silence that comes with peace. It was the sharp silence that follows a shock. When everyone waits for someone else to react, the pilot's request still echoed in the minds of the passengers. Is there a Delta Force sniper on board? It was a sentence that seemed too heavy for a casual flight, too sharp for ordinary ears. She sat upright in row 22, eyes fixed on the aisle. Her breath was steady, but inside her chest tightened with unease. Her earlier sleep felt like a distant memory now, almost like it belonged to another person. She searched the faces around her, wondering if one of them would stand up. Would a quiet stranger suddenly reveal a hidden past, a soldier's story, or would the silence stretch until the pilot spoke again? The waiting was almost worse than the question itself. 2 rows ahead, a man in a gray jacket shifted uncomfortably. He looked like he wanted to rise but stopped himself. The woman across the aisle clutched her handbag closer, as though it could protect her. The child who had asked about a sniper was hushed by his mother's hand. Every gesture felt magnified, every sound louder in the tension. Even the clink of ice in a plastic cup startled a few heads to turn. Finally, a flight attendant walked briskly down the aisle. Her professional smile was gone, replaced with a face that carried urgency. She stopped near the middle of the plane and scanned the rows. Her eyes lingered on the man in the gray jacket, then moved on. The passengers followed her gaze, wondering if she knew more than they did. But she said nothing. She only nodded slightly and kept walking. It was clear the crew was looking for someone or waiting for them to reveal themselves. The woman in row 22 pressed her palms against her knees. Grounding herself, she wasn't the kind of person who liked suspense. She liked certainty, but certainty was gone from this plane, replaced by a question that hovered above them all. She tried to reason with herself. Maybe the pilot had information they didn't. Maybe something outside required action, like another aircraft too close, or maybe something inside was more dangerous. A passenger carrying trouble. Her stomach tightened at the thought. She scanned the rows again, this time with suspicion. Who could it be, she wondered. Everyone looked ordinary. Families, tourists, business travelers. But danger never wore a clear face. It could be hidden behind the most regular smile. The more she looked, the more her imagination grew, and she had to force herself to stop. The man in the gray jacket finally raised his hand slightly, not enough to draw full attention, but enough that the attendant noticed. She leaned toward him, and they spoke in low voices. No one could hear what was said. But the man shook his head firmly. The attendant nodded again, thanked him quietly, and moved on. The woman in row 22 exhaled slowly. Realizing even false alarms added to the weight, the pilot's voice returned. Steady but firm. Please, if you are able, make yourself known. The words carried more urgency now. Less patience. It was no longer just a polite request. It was close to a plea. The passengers exchanged nervous glances. Shifting in their seats, the air grew heavier. Like a storm cloud pressing down on the cabin, her mind replayed the pilot's tone. It wasn't panicked, but it wasn't casual either. It was the voice of a man who had seen something he could not share yet. And that was what made it more unsettling if the pilot didn't explain. Then the truth must have been serious enough to withhold. She thought of the ground far below again, how small her worries usually seemed when she looked down from the sky. But now the distance didn't bring peace. It brought helplessness. She could do nothing but sit, wait, and wonder if someone on board could change everything. The man in the gray jacket leaned back in his seat again. Eyes fixed on the floor, he seemed restless, like he carried something inside he couldn't reveal. But he stayed quiet, and the attendant moved farther to the front. The whispers grew louder around the cabin, like a tide rising with no way to hold it back. Everyone had theories, but no one had answers. The woman in row 22 swallowed hard. She didn't want to be part of a dramatic story. She only wanted to arrive safely. Yet life had placed her here, in this pressurized tube in the sky, where every second of silence felt stretched thin, ready to snap. And though no one yet stood to claim the title of the person the pilot sought, something told her that sooner or later someone would. Because no pilot asked such a question unless he already knew there was a reason to. And when that reason revealed itself, the entire plane would have to face it together. The atmosphere inside the plane felt different now. Even the sound of the engine seemed louder, heavier, like it carried the same tension everyone felt. Passengers were no longer lost in their own worlds. They were linked by the same question. Who was the pilot looking for? And why would he need someone so specific? Every second of silence only made that question sharper. The woman in row 22 shifted in her seat, her body stiff from holding still too long. Her hands gripped the seatbelt across her lap as though it might keep her steady. She wanted answers, but none came. Only quiet movements from the crew and restless glances from strangers. The longer it went on, The more her imagination painted darker possibilities. Was there a threat hidden among them? Or was something outside the window more dangerous than they knew? Another announcement broke the silence, this time from a flight attendant. Her voice tried to sound calm, but the strain was clear. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. We appreciate your cooperation." It was simple, but the choice of words told everyone enough. Something unusual was happening, something that required more than ordinary calm. The woman's eyes followed the crew as they moved back and forth. They spoke to each other in hushed tones, their faces serious. One of them carried a folded piece of paper quickly to the cockpit. Another carefully scanned the cabin as though studying every passenger. It was unsettling to watch. Because the crew usually hid tension well this time, even their training could not cover the urgency. The man in the gray jacket caught her attention again. He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. Staring at the floor as if lost in heavy thought, he looked like someone with a story untold. Was he the one the pilot hoped for, or was he simply another nervous passenger caught in the same storm? His silence made it impossible to know. The whispers in the cabin grew louder. People no longer pretending to stay calm. Some wondered if the plane was in danger from the outside. Others whispered fears of someone on board carrying a weapon. Theories multiplied, but none of them brought comfort. The unknown was the heaviest weight of all. The woman in row 22 leaned closer to the window. She searched the sky beyond, hoping for a clue. But all she saw was endless blue, endless white clouds. No fighter jets, no strange shadows. Nothing unusual outside, that meant the problem. If there was one, had to be inside. The thought sent a shiver down her arms. Suddenly, a sound cut through the air. A faint metallic clang near the back of the plane. Heads turned quickly, eyes wide, hearts skipping. The flight attendants hurried toward the sound. Their movements quick but controlled. No one knew what it was, a dropped cart, a passenger's bag, or something far more alarming. The whispers turned into sharp breaths, the silence breaking into tension once more. The woman in row 22 felt her throat dry. She wasn't someone who liked fear, yet she couldn't escape it now. She wished the pilot would explain, but maybe he couldn't. Maybe too much truth would spark panic. And panic in the air could be worse than silence. Minutes stretched like hours. The crew returned to the front. Their faces gave away nothing, though their hurried pace betrayed urgency. The pilot hadn't spoken again, but his earlier words still lived in every ear. A Delta Force sniper, he had asked for someone rare, someone trained for the extreme. It was not a request that belonged to ordinary skies. The man in the gray jacket finally lifted his head. He glanced toward the cockpit. His jaw tight, his eyes narrowed for a brief second. The woman in row 22 felt certain he knew something. But just as quickly he leaned back again, folding his arms across his chest. If he carried a secret, he wasn't ready to share it yet. The woman closed her eyes for a moment, forcing herself to breathe. She reminded herself that every journey had moments of turbulence. But this wasn't turbulence of air. It was turbulence of the unknown, and sometimes the unknown could rattle the strongest heart. She opened her eyes again, determined to watch, to listen, to stay present. The cabin lights flickered briefly, then steadied. It was nothing unusual, just a shift in the system. But in that charged atmosphere, even the smallest detail felt heavy. Passengers sat frozen, bracing for news. The woman realized that whatever was unfolding, they were already in the middle of it. There was no turning back, no pause button in the sky, and though she couldn't predict it yet, this flight would demand courage not only from one person, but from more than one soul seated in those narrow rows. Because sometimes fate didn't choose a single hero. Sometimes it tested everyone at once, and this flight, high above the earth, was about to prove exactly that. The passengers were restless now. Every second stretched like an hour. Every look carried suspicion. The woman in row 22 felt the tension pressing on her chest. Her body leaned forward without her realizing it, as if waiting for something to finally break. But the silence was louder than any sound. Then the cockpit door opened just a crack. A crew member slipped inside. Closing it quickly behind her, it was a small action, but it drew every eye to the front. People wanted answers. But the answers remained sealed behind that locked door. The hum of the engines seemed to carry the weight of secrets. The woman's mind kept circling the same thought. Why ask for a Delta Force sniper? Not a doctor, not a police officer, not even a soldier. It was a request that pointed to precision, skill, and danger. She rubbed her arms to calm the goosebumps spreading across her skin. Behind her, whispers grew into quiet arguments. One man insisted the announcement was a mistake. Another said no pilot would risk panic for no reason. A woman's voice trembled as she asked what would happen if no one came forward. No one had the answer, not even the crew moving calmly down the aisles. Their calmness was thin, stretched like paper that might tear at any second. Suddenly, the man in the gray jacket stood. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud, but it was enough. Every head turned as though pulled by a string. His posture was strong, his face unreadable, his hands steady. He didn't wave, didn't speak, just walked slowly toward the front. The woman in row 22 felt her heart hammer against her ribs. She didn't even breathe as he moved past. The flight attendants paused, then nodded slightly at him. It was subtle, but it told her enough. This man wasn't just a nervous traveler. There was something in the way he carried himself, something that felt trained, practiced, deliberate. Passengers leaned into the aisles to watch him. Some hopeful, some afraid, all curious, the cabin's silence returned. But this time it was filled with a different energy. Not the silence of confusion, but the silence of expectation. Everyone sensed a shift, as though the story of this flight had reached its turning point. He reached the front and spoke quietly to the crew. No one could hear the words, only the tone, measured, steady. The attendant gave him a quick nod and disappeared into the cockpit. The man stood waiting, hands clasped loosely, gaze fixed forward. He looked calm, but calm like a soldier before action, the kind of calm that hid storms beneath it. The woman in row 22 gripped the armrest. A mix of relief and fear twisted inside her. Relief that someone had answered, fear of what it meant he was needed for, because if he truly was the person the pilot had asked for, then the situation was more serious than anyone had dared to believe. Minutes passed before the cockpit door opened again. The attendant gestured, and the man in the gray jacket stepped inside. The door closed firmly, locking away whatever discussion followed. And just like that, the cabin was left in silence once more. But this silence carried hope as well as dread. Passengers exchanged looks, some nodding to themselves. At least someone had stepped forward. At least someone knew what to do. The woman in row 22 exhaled for the first time in minutes. Her shoulders sagged, though her heart still raced. She looked around and saw others doing the same. Mothers holding their children tighter but calmer. Men leaning back as if forcing themselves to trust. Even the child who had asked about a sniper sat quietly now. The presence of one man had changed the mood of the whole plane. Still, questions gnawed at the edges of every mind. What did the pilot see? What was happening that needed such a person? And why was it unfolding so high above the ground? The woman's eyes drifted to the window. The world below was hidden by thick clouds. It felt as if they were trapped in a separate reality. One where danger floated unseen but close. The minutes crawled as the cockpit remained shut. Every sound was magnified, the cough of a passenger, the creak of a seat, the clink of a glass. The woman tapped her fingers lightly against her knee. Patience was hard to hold when the unknown sat only a few feet away. But she told herself to trust in the pilot, the crew, and now the man in the gray jacket. Whatever storm was building in the background, they weren't alone anymore. Someone had stepped into the role the pilot had called for, and though no one yet knew what lay ahead, they all knew the flight would never be remembered as ordinary again. The cockpit door had closed, but the echo of it still lingered in the cabin. The man in the gray jacket was gone from sight, yet his presence remained heavy in every mind. Passengers sat in uneasy silence, trading glances, whispering only when they thought no one else could hear. The woman in row 22 kept her eyes on the locked door, as if staring long enough might reveal what was happening inside. But the door was firm, giving nothing away. Her heart beat a little slower now, not calm but steadier. Someone had stepped forward, someone the pilot had asked for. That meant there was a plan, even if no one knew what it was yet. But the questions refused to leave her, circling like restless birds. Why a sniper, why now, and why on this flight? A man 2 rows back cleared his throat loudly. "Do you think it's real?" he muttered to the woman beside him. She hushed him quickly, glancing nervously toward the attendants. The attendants were walking the aisles with practiced calm, but their eyes betrayed the truth. They were alert, sharp, watching every movement, listening for every sound. It was not the calm of routine. It was the calm of preparation. The woman in row 22 noticed one attendant pause at the emergency exit.
She checked the handle carefully, running her fingers along the edges.
Then nodded to herself. It was a small act, but it made the passengers near her shift in their seats. No one wanted to imagine why the exits were being checked mid-flight. But the thought crept in anyway, leaving a chill in the air. Minutes passed, long and dragging. Every flicker of light, every creak of metal, seemed sharper than before. The woman leaned back, but her eyes stayed fixed on the front. She wondered what the man in the gray jacket was saying to the pilot right now. Was he calm, giving advice, or was the situation more urgent than anyone had guessed? Her mind wandered back to the clang of metal from earlier. It had sounded harmless at first, but what if it wasn't? What if it was connected to whatever had pushed the pilot to ask for help? The thought made her stomach knot again. She forced herself to breathe slowly, reminding herself that panic would solve nothing. Near the back, a baby began to cry. The sound cut through the tension like a blade. The mother rocked the child gently, whispering soft words. Others glanced back, some annoyed, but most with sympathy. It was strange how even in fear, the sound of a child reminded them of something fragile, something worth protecting. The crew moved down the aisles again, this time offering water. It was an act of comfort, but also a way to keep people still. The woman accepted a small cup. Though her throat was too tight to drink, she held it anyway, the cold plastic grounding her in the moment. She noticed the crew lingered longer near certain passengers, as if silently assessing who might cause trouble and who might help if needed. The minutes stretched and whispers turned into guesses. Some thought there might be a hijacker. Others whispered about a mechanical issue too dangerous to announce. A few insisted the pilot knew something about an outside threat. No one could agree, and yet no one dared raise their voice loud enough to demand the truth. Finally, the cockpit door opened slightly. Every head lifted, every back straightened. The man in the gray jacket stepped out briefly, his face calm but unreadable. He exchanged a few quiet words with the lead flight attendant, then disappeared back inside. It was only a glimpse, but it carried weight. The passengers leaned into the aisles, searching for clues in his expression, but he had given nothing away. The woman in row 22 felt both relief and unease. Relief that he looked steady, unease because the mystery still remained. It was clear now this was not a false alarm, not a mistake. The pilot needed him, and he was involved in something too serious to explain to the cabin. The engines roared steadily beneath them, the plane flying smoothly. But smooth flight meant nothing when the danger wasn't the air. It was something else, something hidden. And though the woman wished to close her eyes and escape back to sleep, she knew she couldn't. No one could sleep through a storm like this, even if the storm was silent. The passengers sat waiting, breathing together, their fate suspended with the man in the gray jacket. And as the minutes ticked away, the woman in row 22 realized a chilling truth. This flight had become more than a journey from one city to another. It had become a test, one that would demand patience, trust, and perhaps courage from them all. And though she didn't yet know what form the test would take, she felt it creeping closer with every heartbeat. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the flight moved deeper into its journey, but no one felt relaxed, not even those who usually enjoyed the quiet of a darkened plane. The earlier request still lived in every mind, and now, with the man in the gray jacket inside the cockpit, the air felt even heavier. The woman in row 22 leaned forward, eyes never leaving the locked door. She wondered what was being said behind it. Were they planning something? Were they already dealing with danger? The silence outside the cockpit didn't match the urgency she imagined inside. That made the waiting harder. It was like hearing a clock tick but not knowing when the alarm would ring. A flight attendant stopped near her row. Checking the overhead bins, her movement seemed routine. But her eyes darted carefully. She pressed the latches firmly, as though making sure nothing was out of place. The woman noticed her hand tremble slightly before she tucked it behind her back. It was a small detail, but it revealed more than words ever could. Suddenly, the intercom crackled. The pilot's voice returned, steady yet strained. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm and stay in your seats. We appreciate your cooperation." He said nothing more. No explanations, no comfort. It was brief. Almost too brief, but in those short words, passengers heard enough. Something was happening. Something they weren't allowed to know yet. A ripple moved through the cabin. Some passengers muttered quietly. Others shifted nervously in their seats. A man near the front raised his voice. "We deserve to know what's going on." But the attendants quickly hushed him, promising everything was under control. The woman in row 22 didn't believe it, not fully. She could see the way the crew avoided each other's eyes. It was the look of people holding in truths too heavy to share. Then it happened, a sound from the rear of the plane, faint but sharp, metal scraping against metal, followed by a soft thud. Heads turned instantly, passengers twisting in their seats. A flight attendant hurried toward the back. Her footsteps brisk, the murmurs grew louder, fear spreading like fire. The woman gripped the armrest, her chest tightening. What was back there? What could cause a sound like that? Her imagination raced. Was it luggage? Was it equipment or something far worse? Every possibility made her pulse beat faster. She glanced toward the window, but the sky outside offered no comfort, only endless clouds. The attendant reached the rear and crouched down. She picked up something small. Hidden in the shadows, her face tightened, but she quickly slipped it into her pocket. No announcement followed, no explanation. But the stiffness in her posture told the passengers enough. It was not a dropped bag, not something simple. The whispers returned, louder than before. Was it a weapon? One man asked. Maybe it's just part of the plane, another said hopefully. But hope felt weak in that moment. The truth, whatever it was, stayed locked in the pockets of the crew and the cockpit. The woman in row 22 pressed her lips together. She wasn't someone who liked guessing games. Yet here she was, trapped in one she never wanted to play. Her body wanted rest, but her mind was racing too fast for sleep. Every sound now carried meaning. Every flicker of light drew suspicion. She could feel the weight of fear binding the cabin together. Minutes later, the cockpit door opened again. The man in the gray jacket stepped out briefly, his expression unchanged. But this time, his eyes swept across the cabin, sharp and assessing. It wasn't a casual glance. It was the scan of someone who had trained for moments like this. He gave a small nod to one of the attendants, then returned inside. The door shut again, and silence followed. The passengers leaned back, some whispering prayers, others clenching fists. No one knew what he had seen, but his presence confirmed one truth. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't routine. Something real, something dangerous, had found its way into their flight. The woman in row 22 closed her eyes briefly. She told herself to stay calm, to hold steady, but deep inside, she knew calmness was fragile, because storms didn't warn before they struck. And this storm, hidden in the shadows of the plane, was drawing closer with every passing minute. She opened her eyes again, her gaze fixed firmly on the cockpit. Whatever answers were coming, they would not stay hidden forever soon. The truth would spill into the cabin, and when it did, every passenger, including her, would be pulled into it. There was no way to escape, not in the sky, not at 30,000 feet. The minutes ticked by slowly, each one carrying more weight than the last. The passengers were no longer restless in the same way. They were frozen now. It was as if the entire cabin had agreed in silence to wait, to listen, to hold its breath. The woman in row 22 felt her body tense, her hands resting firmly on the armrests. Her eyes were locked on the cockpit door, waiting for it to open. Then it happened. The door opened, and the man in the gray jacket stepped out with the captain behind him. The captain's face was calm but firm, his voice steady when he spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen, I need your attention." The cabin hushed instantly. Every whisper cut off, every gaze focused forward. "There was an issue in the cargo area of the plane," the captain continued. "Something was discovered that should not have been there." He didn't say what it was, not exactly, but his pause carried the weight of the truth. The passengers shifted in their seats, eyes wide, hearts pounding. The woman in row 22 leaned forward, hardly breathing. "The situation is under control thanks to the assistance of one of our passengers." The captain glanced at the man in the gray jacket, who stood silently beside him. "He is trained to handle matters like this, and I want to assure you that your safety is our top priority." The captain's words were calm, measured, designed to steady the cabin, but the meaning underneath was clear. There had been danger, real danger, and it had been addressed quietly. Gasps rippled through the cabin. Some passengers exchanged nervous glances. Others held their children tighter. The woman in row 22 pressed her lips together, relief mixing with unease. She wanted details, but she also feared them. Sometimes the unknown was terrifying, but sometimes the truth could be worse. The man in the gray jacket didn't speak. He didn't need to. His silence carried more weight than words could. He stood steady, eyes sweeping the cabin once again. It was the look of someone making sure the danger was truly gone. And though no one knew his name, in that moment he became more than just a stranger in a seat. The captain thanked the passengers for their patience and asked them to remain calm. The cockpit door closed again, and the man returned to his seat near the front. A quiet hum of voices rose behind him, questions, guesses. Half-whispered theories filled the air, but no clear answers would come, not from the crew, not from anyone. The woman in row 22 sat back slowly. Her body finally allowed a deep breath. Her chest rising and falling with relief, she realized how tightly she had been gripping the armrest. Her fingers ached as she loosened them. She glanced around and saw similar signs on other faces, fear softening into gratitude, tension melting into quiet disbelief. It struck her then how quickly life could change. One moment she was dozing against the window, dreaming of ordinary things. The next, she was sitting in the middle of a story she would never forget. And though she hadn't been the one to stand up, she felt the weight of it all the same, because when danger hovered in the air, every soul on board carried it together. The baby in the back began to cry again, but this time the sound didn't sharpen the air. It softened it, a reminder of innocence, of life continuing even in the shadow of fear. A few passengers even smiled faintly, the release of tension easing into the cabin. The woman closed her eyes briefly, whispering a silent thanks that the storm had passed. Hours later, when the plane finally descended and the wheels touched the runway, a wave of relief filled the cabin. The sound of tires meeting the ground had never felt so reassuring. Applause broke out, hesitant at first, then louder. Some clapped for the captain, some for the crew, but many for the silent man in the gray jacket. He didn't turn, didn't seek attention. He simply sat quietly as though nothing had happened. The woman in row 22 knew she would never know his full story. She wouldn't know his name, his background, or even what exactly he had done inside that cockpit. But she didn't need to. Sometimes heroes didn't reveal themselves fully. Sometimes they moved like shadows, and this shadow had carried an entire plane safely back to the ground. As she stepped off the plane hours later, her feet touching solid earth again, she looked back once. Row 22 was just another seat now. The aisle just another path, but for her, it had become the place where an ordinary flight turned into something unforgettable. And though the danger was never explained in full, she knew the truth didn't matter as much as one simple fact. They were safe, they had made it, and that was all that counted.